So Nehemiah, chapter 11, we went through 8, 9, and 10 in sequence, and then we went back 8 through 10 as a unit, and we gave 4 weeks of attention to that really just precious section. And so now we've covered things such as their engagement with the scriptures, the festal celebration, the worship, the repentance, the covenant renewal, and now we're back to, as it were, the elements of the daily faithfulness. And Nehemiah 11 restores our bearings to the administrative dynamics of a city that's coming back to life, a city that needs people and intentional efforts to make it strong once more. And the men, we're walking through, reading through, studying the book, The Trellis and the Vine, and it's interesting because I was sharing with them, I sometimes bristle at our propensity, not praise Mill, just the church. We tend toward programs and structures to the fault sometimes of just let's be in the text and let's be in one another's lives. But there's a balance to that, isn't there? Because what is this right here? It's a very structured time. And if we didn't have this structured time, I don't know that we would all be here right now. We would just kind of float in and out. So there's a place for that. And I think Nehemiah also provokes us to recognize that there is a reason for structure. You're going to see leadership structures, you're going to see city structures, administrative elements. We don't need to be overly nostalgic to say, oh, just give me Jesus, and just give me the church, and just give me fellowshipping with believers. Well, that is really great, but, well, first of all, who is Jesus? Well, you find that out by assembling together at set times so that we all know when to be here and to do this together, right? So there's an element of both. So Nehemiah, though, this is very much... it's not the church. It is a city and a nation being reconstituted, and there's some intentionality that has to go into this, and that's a big part of what we're seeing here. And a helpful element to consider here is the list of names. How many of y'all just get thrilled when you see those list of names in the scriptures? Yes, there are a few of us. I thought.
He goes weird.
I just always wanted to speak in tongues, and it sounds like
Well,
that's the actual strategy they use.
Wow.
Miss Jan's class several weeks ago, and one of the sweet ladies in there goes, when I see these lists, I just say, bubba, 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 bubba.
Wow. Well, not always an option when you're doing like public reading and whatnot. But so here we are. And I thought that I appreciated list of names. Like when we were going through Hebrews and Hebrews chapter 11, and then you'd refer back to these Genesis accounts, and you refer back to people that sometimes almost all they were was a genealogical passerby, as it were. And I thought, boy, I love these. And then I've been working through Nehemiah, and even through last night, finishing chapter 12, boy, I was duking it out with the genealogies. And I thought I had a handle on them, and they knocked me back a little bit. But there was a preciousness to it because you start to see connections there. You start to see how Nehemiah is knit together with Ezra and the Chronicles and the Kings and things that are bigger than just this immediate context. And you see relationships, and you see how the Lord's knitted these things together. And so we do have a lot of list of names here, associations, family groups. But these are things that are important because it refreshes our focus on this is the restoration of a nation. You know, we think about Nehemiah, and sometimes to a fault we'll do things like, how many of you are familiar with Grace Community Church of the Valley in Sun Valley, California? That's Grace Community Church with John MacArthur. And sometimes what we do is we say, oh, John MacArthur's church, but you know what? It's the Lord's church, and it's constituted of a lot of people. And sometimes we see the book of Nehemiah, we're like, oh, Nehemiah. Okay, we're grateful. Nehemiah structured it, gave leadership. But this was a nation that was being reconstituted. This was an exiled people. And why were they exiled? Yes, it's exactly what Moses said was going to happen, right? And then what happened after they're exiled? The season discipline came to a conclusion. Jeremiah, what was he told? Go ahead and build houses. Get comfortable, because you're going to be here for a while. But you will return to the land. And here they are. And it's a nation. It's a restoration of a people. So these things help us when we see these list of names and these connections. It helps us to recognize, oh, it's not just Nehemiah leading a little group of merry men building a wall. This is a people group. and it's an important people group. And again, that breadth keeps us from becoming centered on a singular character. And I think that's a helpful thing for us to remember as well, because these were real people doing something magnificent. And both in the immediate application, so in the immediate application, they've rebuilt the walls. That's pretty impressive, right? 52 days. I get nothing done in 52 days. And here they've done an amazing work. And we're going to see in chapter 12 next week that you're going to have large groups, a significant choir, the leadership. They're walking on the walls. They're walking on top of the walls, and they're singing and giving thanks to God. And so they've accomplished something. So the immediate application is quite poignant and presently there. But it also is important because the book of Nehemiah is not just floating out there as a story to grab, is it? It has a place. Let's see, I don't know if I can do this fast enough. Well, I'm not going to fool with it. I'll show you later. We were at a funeral Friday, and it was... It's all you should always. I'm under the conviction always mourn with funerals. I know we've gotten to this pattern of celebration of life, and we do celebrate life, and we give thanks to God for that. But there's loss. There's tangible loss, and it should provoke you to recognize that death is spoken of as an enemy, and it's the final enemy that will be put to death. And so we look forward to that day. But the church that we were at for the service.
Sorry, the sign is in here?
Yeah.
Oh, there you go.
They're in the corner.
Get a mama.
Okay. Nobody fit anybody else, but okay.
Well, so in the stained glass in the background was it what, like 20 feet wide or so?
I don't know.
You're a bad guesser, I guess. It's 20 feet at
I
least.
cannot estimate anything really.
But it was beautiful stained glass, and if you looked at it, it's like, oh wow, that's really something. But then if you paid attention, it was all the way from creation to final redemption. And it was just knitting of the story together. And Nehemiah has a place in that. So it helps us remember immediate application, and it fits in God's larger economy in terms of what he was doing and restoring a people and bringing them back to the land. And it was a story of redemption of nations and groups and people all the way down to individuals. Derek Kidner makes a statement I think is really helpful. I'm just going to read it in full. It's just a couple of sentences here. Actually, it's like it's not a David sentence. It is a couple of sentences. He says, quote, "It is not bureaucratic pedantry that has preserved these names. The point is, once more, that these people and their chronicler are conscious of their roots and of their structure as God's company. This is no rabble of refugees settling down anywhere. They have the dignity of order and of known relationships. Above all, their calling to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." And we've emphasized that again and again, haven't we? From Exodus 19, that before you have even the establishment of the priesthood, you have that the nation is a nation of priests. And guess who picks that up? The apostle who starts with a P. Everybody likes to pick on him.
Peter.
Very good. And he quotes the Exodus 19:6, and he refers to the church now as a people set apart, a kingdom of priests, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession. Why? Because we're a witness-bearing people. We declare the excellencies of God, and now specifically as a church, we declare the excellencies of God in Christ, and we make it known to other peoples. So 11:1 and 2, we have the repopulation of Jerusalem. The repopulation of Jerusalem, there's several leadership structures here with the restored exile community ranging from government to religious to family units. Again, for the men who are in the groups, and if you're not, Thursday nights, 7 p.m. There are others that meet. But a few weeks ago, see, that was a misconception from the pulpit of all places. If you look at Acts chapter 20, the Apostle Paul is endeared to the point that he's investing, and by the way, he also tells the Ephesians elders night and day. But he's teaching so long, it's going to midnight. Eutychus falls out the window, he dies, it's okay, it works out. And then Paul has a meal. I mean, he's even eating late. This is a guy that we can follow.
Do you want to be like Paul, or do you want to be like Jesus? Jesus got up early in the morning.
Paul told us to be imitators of him as he is of Christ. Oh, that's true. Anita had a good answer for that.
Oh, no.
that people should imitate him as he imitates Christ.
Yeah, well, Paul is also a sinner, and he didn't imitate.
Jesus stayed up late too.
Yes,
Jesus stayed up late in the garden.
if it was consequential, Jesus stayed up late. I mean, so,
You want to fall out windows and die.
that is something I always bear with me when I go into the pulpit. Like, David, don't kill Eutychus. You've got to stop. You've got to stop at some point in time. I do think about these things.
In all seriousness, the groups are growing rather well, though.
Yes. And one of the things that we do talk about, so we are sweeping back, is, again, there is a trellis or a structure for the vine to grow. And so is such, again, as we mentioned, so it is with the nation. There's a bureaucracy, there's government, there's religious leaders, there's family units. And when you look at these things and you see, like, you start to glaze over and start to think, like, oh, where's the storyline? When's it going to pick back up? When's it going to get exciting? When is he going to thrash people like Ezra did? No, but he does severely rebuke them. But you need to recognize that when you see these things, when you see these structures, when you see these elements, that was designed by the Lord. And that was what he wanted for this people. And it's something we don't need to just cavalierly disregard. And the focus here that we'll see is that Jerusalem needed to be populated. So we see here, now the leaders of the people lived in Jerusalem. There was the leadership was securely in Jerusalem, but the rest of the people had to cast lots, or there was an exercising of casting lots, which, by the way, it's not a practice we do. But you have it in Jonah, you have it here, you have it in multiple places. You even have it for the selection of the final apostle who takes Judas's place. There's a reason we don't do it, for the most part, because we have the indwelling Holy Spirit, we have the full canon of Scripture, and when those elements of life that we're just not quite sure what to do, we seek wisdom and we get counselors. Fair enough? And then sometimes we do flip a coin. It's equivalent to casting a lot. But here, and this was not them just whimsically saying, oh, I'm in the city, I'm out. This is, we're submitting ourselves to the providential direction of God. He will cause the lot to fall where he chooses. And there was a confidence in God, not a confidence in things like the lottery where it's pure chance. This is a confidence in God. And so they're casting lots to determine who will populate the city. And so you have 1 out of 10 or 10% of the population, which, while it wasn't a huge population, that's pretty consequential to have that many people committed to re-inhabit the city, as it were. And you also have a range of inhabitants, which is kind of interesting. You don't just have the leadership. You don't just have the priests or the Levites. You have a range of people. And it should be. This is reflective of the capital city. But really, more importantly, it's also the holy city. It's referred to twice as the holy city in this chapter, and this is the first time we see that in the book. More persons are needed, but it's to occupy the holy city, a city that's been set apart, distinguished, as it were, by God himself. And again, we see that the leaders of the people, who are they? They're heads of fathers' houses, governing officials, overseers, priests, etc. So you have a lot of people, the leadership are congregating there. Who are the lay people? Well, they are a whole breadth of people. And the idea was that they would exercise, and they would determine the will of God to determine who would populate the city. Make it strong again. A city needs people. Let's see. And again, the holy city. Why was Jerusalem referenced as the holy city? Just ideas. Was it just Nehemiah's favorite? And so he's like, that city, that's the holy one. Because there's a lot of cities being populated at the time.
That's where the temple was.
Where the temple or a temple?
The temple.
So you have the place that the Lord chose to identify with his covenant people. That's going to distinguish that city. Does that mean he was not the God of the nations? No, that's not at all the case. But that was central hub for the worship of Yahweh. And from there, the excellencies of Yahweh were to be declared to the nations. Don't ever get the idea that throughout redemptive history it was Israel or bust. It was out of Israel. Would you believe? Would you submit? Would you worship? When they're fulfilling their charge with excellence and faithfulness, they were a witness-bearing nation, kingdom of priests, as was already mentioned. But this is the holy city. It was a city whose identity was centered on the worship of the Lord. It's going to distinguish it. It's going to distinguish it. It was set apart. It hosted the temple. Again, it was where he met with his people in worship and prayer and repentant restoration. You see Solomon, when he's establishing the temple, he makes it very, very clear. This is not where the Lord of glory dwells. He can't be contained in this box. But when we stray and we look toward this place, would you hear us? When we worship, which does the Lord of glory need the blood of bulls and goats and the fat and the wave offerings and the grain offerings? No, but this is where he has chosen to accept and embrace those sacrifices from his people and from peoples that will submit to him. So it was a distinguished place. And then there's the blessing of the inhabitants. We see for all, and the people blessed all the men who are willing to offer, who willingly offered to live in Jerusalem. It's not that like, oh, you got the lot, guess you're going to Jerusalem. They're affirming and honoring. This is a valuable service. You know, they were all in the restoration of Jerusalem. They had sacrificed for this. They had wanted to be successful. And they're affirming and honoring the value of the service of those who would go and inhabit the city. It was a commendable act. And if you remember back to 7 verses 4 and 5, we see the city was wide and large, but the people within it were few, and no houses had been rebuilt. And so we recognize, first of all, that it wasn't strong yet. It's hard to be the first, right? It's hard to occupy the city again. But why is it worth it? When we look at verse 5, then my God put it in my heart to assemble the nobles and the officials and the people to be enrolled by genealogy. And I found the book of the genealogy of those who came up at the first, and I found written in it, and then we have one of the major genealogies. And so I want you to see two things. The Lord put it in his heart. Remember, this is all the way back to when he's doing the scouting mission. He didn't tell anybody what the Lord put in his heart. He didn't tell everybody at that point in time, and he says over and over again, this is God's purpose for the people to reconstitute this city, to rebuild it. And so, but it's also the Lord who put it in his heart to have the genealogies. And if you look back, you might have thought at the time like, oh boy, why is he doing Zerubbabel and Jeshua and these genealogies and the old ones at that? Well, it's setting the stage for where we are here in chapter 11, when now you can take those genealogies and those records and the identification of the people and find out, well, how can we parse this out so that we can repopulate the city? Now do we love genealogies just a tiny bit more? Tiny bit more? We're going to love them when this is all said and done. But there was a pragmatic reason. It lacked infrastructure. It lacked people. It lacked sufficient housing. And we have to come to, one of the things that's nice about Nehemiah, especially for people like me, is that I can be thoroughly impractical because I might have, well, this is what the Lord desires and needs to be accomplished. Well, you know what? There's step 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And I like those little steps. But sometimes we have to balance ourselves. This is a very pragmatic thing, isn't it? It's repopulating a city. It takes people. It takes work. But it wasn't purely pragmatic. It was what the Lord put in Nehemiah's heart. 3 to 6. 3 to 6, we have the residents of Jerusalem, the sons of Judah. You see what that is? It's a lot of names, right? But if we looked at the class roll, it's a lot of, well, it's like 19 of you, but it's still a lot of names. And those names represent what? Yeah. And are y'all real people? Are you consequential? Yeah, okay, so these are real people.
Make sure he's real. Sorry.
Oh, yeah. I'll let y'all work that out. But so we have a record of the people, and it speaks broadly of those who are dwelling on properties outside of the city. Is that okay? Yes, they don't all have to be. This is the restoration of Judah. Ultimately Israel, but for this time it's Judah, the southern kingdom predominantly being restored here. You have a range of persons, and primarily, what are the two tribes that are really being spoken to and populated here? The tribes of who and who?
Judah and Benjamin.
Judah and Benjamin. Now, why them? Somebody besides Lita. Somebody, come on, somebody help me out. If not, I'll go back to Lita. Any ideas?
Well, those were the tribes of southern Judah, the southern kingdom, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we don't have time to develop it right now, but the southern kingdom was kingdom of Judah, and there was a certain affection they had for one another. And if you look at Paul, that affection continues on. He was of the tribe of Benjamin. There's a pride with that. They had the first king of Israel, right? He obviously hated the second king, who was from Judah. But there was a season in their history, and Benjamin was almost totally wiped out. But they were restored, and there was an affection between these tribes. And Benjamin did stay with Judah for the most part during the time of separation. So here you have, they're the predominantly core groups of people you're seeing here. It's going to be a breaking up of this chunk of Judah, this chunk of Benjamin. So you see the sons of Benjamin and sons of Judah. So we see that's going to be predominantly. What's the other tribe that we're going to hear a good bit of? Levites. And why we just throwing out Bible trivia here. Why the Levites? Yeah, and where was their tribal territory or allotment?
Everywhere. Weren't they little cities scattered throughout all the tribes?
Yeah, the cities of refuge. So they had cities throughout the kingdoms. They didn't have a territory, as it were. Their territory was their service to the Lord. So you're going to see the Levites. You see several people. We're not going to develop the genealogies, but that's not because it's not valuable. I did give attention to it in the study guide, and I would encourage you to, because I'll tell you again, while I found Nehemiah 11 valuable and helpful, when I was working through 12, it demanded I look back at 11. It demanded, it's Ron, he's enthusiastic. It demanded I look back at other genealogies. It demanded I give consideration to Ezra, because these things are knit together. And it wants you to see these relationships, as we'll discuss more next week. But among the more interesting things I'll just highlight for time's sake, you do see one of the elements is Judah and Tamar. And you see the thread of the Davidic line coming through them with one of the family units here. And you see how the providence of God is working itself out. And then it concludes with that one particular section that ends with verse 6, that there were 468 valiant or strong men. So pretty substantial group. Then 7 to 8, we have the residents, the sons of Jerusalem from Benjamin. Again, a small tribe, but a consequential tribe in its own right. And here we see 928 men of valor. And when we see men of valor and we're thinking Old Testament, where do you tend to think, how do you think they're tending to speak of someone? Maybe a what? Yeah, like somebody that's in combat, right? You don't just cavalierly use these words. And these probably are not necessarily intentionally just saying men of combat, but they're esteemed men. They're somebody we need to give attention to. Doesn't necessarily mean warrior-like status, but it should provoke us to remember that, again, these are people, and these are consequential people. When the Scriptures call them something significant, let's at least give it attention. Then they have an overseer, someone who's providing some oversight. You have Joel, the son of Zikri, I believe, we'll go with that, served as the overseer of these men in the city. And he had some measure of supervision, presumably over the areas of responsibility identified with living in the city. There was an administrative hierarchy. Like I was talking to our men on Thursday night, sometimes to help you understand the value of structure and administration, we tend to say, small government, our government's too big, but aren't we grateful we have government? It gives structure. I don't necessarily like it, but it's a bunch of fallen men with fallen intentions and motives, but it's also a common grace. It does keep some order and structure. And there are times, obviously, to recognize that. Joel's an overseer. He's an administrator. This is important to have some oversight and hierarchy. Were they godly people? Yes. Are they prone to stray? Yes. Do they get lazy? Probably. He gave them some direction. Gave him some oversight. It doesn't mean that our two friends from chapter 7, does anybody remember their names? They're almost identical. If you have twins...
Hanani and Hanai, is that it?
Yes. Yeah, so if you have twins, twin boys.
I just remember thinking that was so weird.
Yeah, you need Hanani and Hananiah.
Oh, Hananiah.
Yeah, so does that mean that they're no longer...
Christiana do it nearly the same time.
Yeah,
so.
she has a girl though.
Yeah. Well, Hananiah could be a girl's name.
Yeah, you add the AH.
Hannah and Hananiah.
There you Now, does that mean that remember, chapter 7, because we don't just float and say that chapter 11 is all by itself, so we have the government structure that Nehemiah put in place, Hananiah, but they were, I would presume, still in place. I don't think anything major's happened, but this just tells you the structure continues down. It's an authoritative structure to keep it a well-ordered society. And then we have 10 to 14. 10 to 14, the residents of Jerusalem, the priest. Now, these are important folks, aren't they? If it's a holy city, a city centered on worship, who do you want? Yeah, so here we have the priests. So following the record of the sons of Judah and the sons of Benjamin were the priests who lived in the city. And these were divided into 3 groups. And next week the grouping is going to be important. So we'll just tuck that away for now. So we'll recognize 3 groups. We have 822 persons. We're starting to develop quite a substantial group. That's one of them. That's group 1. Group 2, 242 persons. Group 3, 128 persons. But then there's a little providential isn't this exciting to watch this nugget drop in? Let's see if I can find his name so that we can treat him properly. No. Ahitub. Oh boy. Ahitub.
Ahitub, right there.
Yeah, I
How
hate
about
mispronouncing names,
Number
and I seem to
12.
have a very
No,
unique skill at it.
11, verse 11. Ahitub, ruler
Okay.
of the house of God.
The high toad.
Ahitub.
So it's really hard.
I think it's Ahitub.
But you know what's really neat about this? And this is, again, where I just want to kind of put a teaser out to enjoy genealogies. He was the son of a son of a son of a son, and you trace this back. And you end up at 1 Samuel chapter 22. 1 Samuel chapter 22, where you have the ruler of the house of God was of the family of family line. As we trace it back here, that was the family line that King Saul attempted to destroy. Remember, King David went and said, I need something for my men, and I could use a sword. And, well, all we got's this sword from the guy you lopped his head off, Goliath. Which, I mean, if any man deserves to carry Goliath's sword, it's the guy that used it to lop Goliath's head off of. Which is not in the children's Bibles, and that's it's not... What a disservice to grow up and be like, whoa! Just go ahead.
Suddenly things just got really horrific around here.
Yeah, but it's important. It's part of what happened. And David said, I will separate your head from your body. And doggone, he made good on it. So the priest gives David the sword of Goliath. And it gets back to King Saul through basically a little snitch. And what does he do? It shows you just how far Saul had gone. He tries to wipe out that whole family line. But in the Lord's kindness, one does escape. He takes refuge with David, and now we have one of his sons here, ruler of the house of God. So consequential, and it should matter to us. And we rejoice in these unique providences that get highlighted every so often. Then we see the residents of Jerusalem, the Levites. Obviously, the priest came out of the Levites, but the Levites, as we discussed, are a consequential group. They serve to serve the priest, and they serve the people. And we've already seen they've collected holy taxes, as it were, and other like things, tithes from the people. And we have a record of the Levites who resided in this city. And again, here we see that Jerusalem. Let's see, where is it? Yes. All the Levites in the holy city. So again, we see Jerusalem's a what city?
Holy city.
Okay, and it's properly seen as a holy city, set apart, distinguished for the worship of the Lord. And it's proper to be identified as a holy city with the Levites because that was the nature of their service, was helping the worship of God and helping the maintaining of the law and the serving the priests and the people for that matter. So we have 284 Levites. And we've talked about how that's strange, isn't it? That we have all these, but so few Levites.
Priests.
Yeah, it's a little weird. But it should remind you of something. And it'll come up again next week, is that in terms of redemptive history and just history here, Nehemiah is post what? Starts with an E.
Exodus.
Post-exile, right? Things have changed. There's things that are different. They're not necessarily as they were. and things are going to be different. And it was during the time of the exile that you even have the creation of the synagogues. And you have things that, in terms of providence of God, things kind of move sometimes, and they shape differently. Well, here, this is just one of those things where usually you have fewer priests than Levites because the priests come out of the Levites. They serve the priests, but there could be a variety of reasons for that. But we only have 284 Levites in the group. Then we see that Mattaniah was identified in this group through his lineage. So he was the son of Micaiah, son of Zabdi, son of Asaph. Who what? What was Asaph? Yes, I see that hand. So son of Asaph. Why does that matter? Why should that catch our attention?
So, I thought you were calling on Anton. Were you
Oh,
calling on
kind of.
him? Oh, he was a psalmist?
Yeah, he was one of the worship leaders with David. You see him over and over again in the Psalms. A Psalm of Asaph or a Psalm of Asaph with David. And so you have some pedigree here. And you see that this person here was leader of the praise who gave thanks. And so again, we see those family connections and how the generational impact. And we see that this is consequential. And if you think that singing and worship through song and through instruments doesn't matter, then come next week. And if you miss it, feel terrible because it's a substantial emphasis. And I've come under more and more conviction that be done well, which is hard for me because I don't sing well and I'm not musical. I have piano fingers, but no piano that I can play. But that matters. It matters. There's a measure of excellence with this. And so he's the son of the lineage of Asaph, and he also is overseeing praise and giving thanks. It's a heritage leading the music, leading music with other believers. They're in charge of songs of thanksgiving. They should always get our attention. Boy, we're running short on time, so I keep just moving here. Abda was identified through the lineage of his multiple generations, and he's another fruit of musical heritage, a descendant who, along with Asaph, was appointed to serve through worshiping music and instruments. So we see again, if you look at 1 Chronicles 16, 1 Chronicles 25, Psalm 77, these two men's ancestors, Asaph and Jeduthun, are identified together as choir masters, as song leaders, and serving in these capacities, and those capacities matter. Part of how the Lord of Glory wanted to be worshipped is through song and instrument. And you're like, well, I'm not sure. Well, David, he really cemented that. And he made sure that would be a part of the worship from his time forward. We need to make sure and respect that. And as with the priest, the family ties plainly show the richness of heritage. And so I'm hoping you're starting to see that. You see that those names matter and that they're connected to people. And even if you're not connected to somebody, they're like, oh, you got the special one in your family line. There's a pedigree of enduring faithfulness, walking with God, being kept by God. Part of the blessing, part of the general blessing of God was that you would have sons. And that wasn't because boys, yay. It was because that was how the family line was preserved, right? And that was a reflection of God's blessing. And the fact that generations were sustained is a kindness. And there was ways to protect that as well. So you have the kinsman redeemer, and you had laws that would be instituted to preserve family lines. And thankfully so, because that's where Ruth and Boaz come in, and we have profitable things that result from that. But that's how that whole, it's not just a love story for Valentine's Day, but aren't we grateful it happened? We also have Zadok here. If you trace back, he's really important. Why is he important? The line of David and the line of Zadok, they're tight. That's the kingly line, that's the priestly line. That's the line that will endure. That's the line that shows up in Ezekiel. That's the line that shows up. If you have David, you have Zadok the priest. And you just watch. You just kind of peppered through. Oh, there he is. Oh, the Lord's being faithful and keeping his promises. Oh, the Lord's sustaining that line just like he said he would. 11:19, the residents of Jerusalem. The gatekeepers, you have 172, verses 20 and 21. I'm not trying to diminish any of these. The residents of Jerusalem, the temple servants and their overseer, Some of them resided in towns in the inheritance in Judah. That's fine, and I provided a map for you. You can't show it today, but they're peppered throughout. The temple servants also addressed as taking residence in Ophel, Ophel. Where is that at, by the way? Can you visit Ophel? Can you find it on a map? Come on, good Nehemiah students, you've walked with us for weeks and months. You're right, it's just south of the temple. And it's where the temple servants, many of them would reside. And why? Oh, it's like having your pastor live across the soccer field. It's very convenient. We need a pastor. Well, here it comes. Can someone preach? We're in a bind. Yes, no problem. But it was proximity, and that was helpful. And that tells you, again, the emphasis that we're going to have a place here that's going to have special attention and provide and facilitate for the worship. 22 to 24, Levitical oversight and a royal liaison. This part of the chapter is kind of curious, and you're good Bible students, and you recognize when there's a tension or problem perceived in the text. Whose problem is that? Yours or the Scriptures? It's your problem, and that's okay, because it can be resolved. And you have an aberration of the pattern, and you have everybody's overseer kind of follows their group, and then you have the Levites, and then you have the temple servants, but then you have the Levites overseer. And some people say, oh, that was where the chronicler or this person got things out of order or was added later. It just went in a different pattern. And we can be okay with that, right? Don't pick a fight with the Scriptures when there's a point of tension and think that you're going to come out on top. You don't have to. They'll vindicate themselves. And maybe you're just going to have to be content that it's not always as clean as we'd like for it to be. But we have one who's providing oversight to the Levites there. Again, he's also giving, it's Uzi who also musical emphasis. Are we seeing a redundancy and focus here? Worship and music and music and worship. And in that regard, it's really interesting. Derek Kidner, again, obviously I find him valuable. He made a valuable statement regarding why you need these structures and this leadership with song worship. And basically he states, this is esteeming the role of musicians in their work in a different capacity, understanding also the monetary support, because they were supported in that regard, and the structural support. And he says the reason for this is that worship was too important to be left unplanned. We don't just go and be like, there's a sweetness to being able to go to a singing service where Psalm 237, people turn there like, yes, I love that when we all sing together. And those are sweet times, but that should be exceptional times. Okay, so we want structure, we want discipline. Just like we don't just get up in the pulpit and be like, I'll preach on this. There's an intentionality. There's a reason that people are set apart to labor and to work and to struggle and to pray through things. Well, same with music in various regards.
David,
Yes,
I have
ma'am.
a question about that. Because I just wonder about the differences. Because back in Genesis, when Cain was after he had killed Abel and he was sent off, and their kids were the ones that were musicians and stuff. Where does that come in?
I don't know.
Too far back?
Yeah.
I was just curious if it was connected or not.
Not that I would know of. Yeah.
Okay.
I'll give you the
Sorry,
stump the
you were
pastor
right there.
points. You get a donut. I'm sorry. But I am grateful you're aware enough of the text that it even addresses that. We see provisions are specifically commanded by the king, and that was not King David, although he did provide for that. That was, we see here, the king concerning them a fixed provision. That was actually King Artaxerxes. He helped maintain some of these things, and that was part of the providence of God. We have a gentleman there who's a representative. That doesn't mean Nehemiah was out of the picture, but there was a liaison between the king and this other gentleman, part of the structure. 25 to 30, we're getting there. Residents of Judah and the providence of Judah. Here there was a listing of 17 cities that the tribe of Judah was populating around the city of Jerusalem. And we have the range from Beersheba to the valley of Hinnom. And we can look at the map and we can see this range, and it's all basically mostly south and parallel to the city. But that makes sense because that's where the people of Judah went, and it would talk about how they would go in the cities of their heritage. Why was it their heritage? Because it was the land that they occupied, and it was the land promised to them, and it was the land that their families identified with. Then you have 31 to 36 residences of Benjamin, and they also had tribal territories and lands, and they're staying in those cities. Again, those are going to be slightly north of Jerusalem, and this is consistent with what we expected of the patterns of the tribes before the exile. And the Levites, it has just kind of like a little addendum that the Levites were staying with some of the tribes of Benjamin, and as would be expected. So let me finish with this, and I'll finish in such a way that you can see it with me here, because it's a little bit long, but I think it's helpful. Well, that here. The grace of God and heritage, and this is, I think, you get a fitting conclusion for emphasis, and obviously I did the whole thing yellow. I have no concept of highlighting, obviously. But it is important, and I want you to see the value of heritage. So just follow, if you would. So you may never visit Israel or have the slightest interest in pursuing an opportunity if it were available. I recognize that. I don't understand it, but I do recognize it. Because of that, you may never see Jerusalem with your own eyes in person in this natural life. And I do say this natural life because we know the Apostle John says the beloved city is going to ascend from the heavens, and we'll see the restored Jerusalem. However, the holy city of Jerusalem is of no small consequence, and its foundational element it is a foundational element in our spiritual heritage. The names that were examined in Nehemiah 11 may seem to be of no apparent consequence to you, but they served their people well. You recognize that? These people were faithful. They were part of God's people, and they were walking in obedience. And in this, in serving their people, they served the Lord well too. They supported the beloved city in her infancy of restoration, and it was that very city that the Lord Jesus would triumphantly enter and in a discreet upper room on a Passover so many years later institute the new covenant through his blood. This is a consequential city. And aren't we grateful for this long time heritage? The story of the faithfulness exercised in Nehemiah 11 is a chapter in our larger spiritual heritage, and we would do well to give thanks to God for the grace he's extended through this story that is so much larger than ourselves. And it does remind us that there's a whole lot more to this than just ourselves. We get very myopic. Well, we're going to have a missions moment, but that means I'm going to have to leave in an efficient way, and I'd encourage you to be prepared for the worship service. So let's close in prayer, and then we will disperse to the worship service. Lord, we again give thanks to you. These names and these people and the structure and the seemingly mundane ways that they walked in faithfulness and obedience, from our perspective, for theirs it's extremely consequential and sacrificial and expressions of faithfulness. So Lord, we're grateful, and I pray that we would see this and that we would appreciate it properly, that we would recognize that you have been at work in ways that are so magnificent and that exceed sometimes how short-sighted we view redemptive history and how short-sighted we think about how you've accomplished your purposes. So we give thanks to you, Lord, and ask that we would respond well, that we would think well, and that through these things we would engage our world in a manner that is a witness-bearing people, declaring the excellencies of Christ one to another as we worship together, expressing them to you, declaring them to other peoples, and that we would be faithful. If our names are written in some log or some genealogical record as someone reflects back, may it be to the praise of your glory. And so we ask these things in Jesus' good name.